The UK stood still. King Charles just shattered centuries of royal tradition with a single announcement, and the entire monarchy may never be the same. No warning, no whispers, just a nation watching in disbelief as the king made the most unexpected declaration of modern royal history. In a voice steady but sharp, King Charles announced that the monarchy, an institution older than many nations, would no longer operate as it had for centuries. The lavishness, the sprawling royal calendar, the sea of distant cousins on public payroll, all of it was about to change. The monarchy, once seen as untouchable, was about to be cut down to its core. Only 4 names would remain at the heart of the crown: King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, and William's direct heirs. Everyone else, no matter how blue their blood was, being stripped of their official duties and public-funded privileges. No more appearances on balconies, no more royal tours, and most importantly, no more unchecked access to taxpayer funds. It was a royal purge with financial precision. Behind this decision wasn't just fiscal reform, it was a dramatic shift in philosophy. For generations, titles equaled entitlement, but not anymore. Under King Charles, the monarchy would now have to earn its place, prove its value, and justify every penny spent in its name. Royal events, personal expenditures, even the daily functions of the crown would face a level of public scrutiny previously unimaginable. The message was loud and clear: royalty is no longer an automatic pass to luxury. It's a job with limits, with rules, and with consequences. And the shock didn't stop there. Because this wasn't a symbolic gesture to appease critics or quiet protesters. It was the dismantling of an outdated hierarchy, a break from the inherited privilege that had defined the British monarchy for centuries. Charles wasn't just shifting the spotlight. He was turning it inside out. In one sweeping move, he had rewritten the very script of what it meant to be royal. For the public, it was a moment of awe, confusion, and divided opinion. Some hailed the king's courage, calling it a long-overdue reckoning. Others saw it as a dangerous step toward eroding one of the last standing symbols of British identity. But no one could deny the scale of the transformation. This was not evolution. This was revolution in royal robes. The monarchy, once protected by mystery and tradition, was now on display like never before. And as the dust settled, one question echoed across the country. But why now? What could push a king to challenge everything the crown once stood for? Eggs flew, chants echoed, and anger spilled into the streets. Signs the monarchy's power was slipping long before Charles acted. The tension wasn't new. It had been simmering beneath the surface for decades, a quiet rebellion that was waiting for the right moment to erupt. In 1964, Queen Elizabeth's visit to Quebec was met with public disapproval. Protesters didn't hold back. What should have been a diplomatic show of unity turned into a visible rupture between the crown and the people. That was just the beginning. In 1981, as Prince Charles toured New York during a politically volatile time, protests exploded, once again fueled by anger over Northern Ireland. Demonstrators weren't just angry, they were bold enough to risk arrest. And 4 of them did, signaling that public frustration with the monarchy wasn't isolated. It was growing, loud, and increasingly defiant. But nothing made that reality clearer than the protests that began circling King Charles himself. In November 2022, barely months into his reign, Charles and Queen Camilla were greeted not by fanfare, but by flying eggs during a public appearance in York. The act was symbolic, shocking, and utterly humiliating. The message? The crown no longer commanded automatic respect. It had to earn it or lose it. Protesters didn't just want attention, they wanted accountability. And behind this fury was a swelling movement, Republic, a group demanding the monarchy be replaced by an elected head of state. Their rallying cry, "Not my king," was no longer whispered in fringe corners. It thundered through public squares, fueled by frustration and fanned by modern ideals. And it wasn't just the older royals who faced resistance. Even the younger, seemingly more relatable ones weren't safe. In 2022, Prince William and Kate Middleton embarked on a Caribbean tour meant to celebrate Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. But instead of celebration, they walked into a storm. In Belize, their first event had to be cancelled after locals erupted in protest. These weren't isolated critics, they were communities still grappling with the monarchy's colonial legacy. For them, royal pageantry was a painful reminder of exploitation and erasure. And they weren't interested in photo shoots. They wanted change. The backlash was loud, emotional, and impossible to ignore. The once glowing image of the royal family now cast a much darker shadow. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the criticism wasn't just coming from far-off lands. It was boiling at home. The British public, struggling with rising costs, economic pressure, and growing inequality, began to question why palaces still gleamed while schools and hospitals faltered. Why should taxpayers foot the bill for luxury while the nation tightened its belt? Opulence had lost its shine. The royal lifestyle no longer inspired admiration, it provoked outrage. And King Charles, who had long prided himself on his environmental causes and public service, couldn't turn a blind eye any longer. He was caught in a storm of tradition and transformation, privilege and pressure. He heard the protests. He saw the signs. And deep down, he knew the institution was cracking. The crown had weathered wars, scandals, and centuries of change, but now it faced something far more dangerous: indifference. The people no longer cared for a monarchy that sat behind gold gates. They demanded relevance. They demanded reform. Faced with rebellion from his own people, Charles knew he couldn't hide in castles anymore. Balmoral and Sandringham, once private royal escapes, are now gifts to the people. And it's just the beginning. In a move that few believed a monarch would ever make, King Charles handed over two of the most treasured jewels in the crown, not to his heirs, not to the aristocracy, but to the public. Balmoral, the quiet refuge of royalty tucked away in the Scottish Highlands. Sandringham, the sacred ground where royal traditions took root. These were not just properties. They were symbols of wealth, of secrecy, of privilege passed down through blood. And yet, Charles unlatched the gates, stepped back, and said something no royal before him had dared. These now belong to everyone. It wasn't a symbolic photo op. It was structural, sweeping, and deeply personal. Balmoral would no longer echo with the silence of private luxury, but ring with voices of learning and remembrance as a museum, as a research hub, as a bridge between history and the present. Sandringham, too, was transformed, not into yet another monument to monarchy, but into a place where people could live, work, and connect. Community housing was no longer a dream, hidden behind palace walls. It was built into the very heart of royal land. The message was louder than any crown jewel could gleam. The monarchy exists for the people, not above them. For centuries, these estates were fortresses of exclusivity, lavish, sprawling, and off-limits. But now, they were open, real, and reachable, no longer cloaked in mystery. For the first time, ordinary citizens could step through halls once reserved for kings and queens and feel like they belonged there. Charles wasn't just changing who got to walk those paths. He was redefining why those paths even existed in the first place. This act became more than just generosity. It was a dismantling of the very hierarchy that once separated royals from the rest. By opening Balmoral and Sandringham, Charles didn't just share physical space, he broke psychological walls. He blurred the line between monarchy and citizen, between sacred and shared. The pomp and power that once guarded these lands now bowed to the will of unity, transparency, and service. And in that, a new type of royalty was born, one that didn't tower above, but stood beside. Charles knew the history these lands held. He knew the ghosts of empire and entitlement still wandered those grounds. But instead of hiding them behind velvet curtains, he chose exposure, education, engagement. He allowed the public not only to witness the legacy of the crown, but to interact with it, question it, and reshape it. These estates, now breathing with new purpose, marked a dramatic evolution of the royal identity. No longer museums of privilege, they became instruments of progress. The monarchy, through this gesture, began its most difficult task: rebuilding trust. And in doing so, Charles didn't just rewrite history, he offered the people a role in it. But this wasn't just about land. It was about healing old wounds and building something new. In a voice that trembled, King Charles said the unthinkable. "We failed you." The words cut through centuries of silence. For a monarch to admit fault truly, openly, and without condition was something the world had never seen. It wasn't a scripted palace statement, nor a vague nod to the past. It was raw, exposed, and painfully real. Standing before the world, Charles did not hide behind royal protocol or centuries of tradition. Instead, he looked directly at the legacy he inherited and chose to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He didn't flinch when recalling the moments when the monarchy should have stood by its people and chose silence instead. He admitted the cold detachment that had once defined the crown, times when empathy could have saved public trust, but was replaced by rehearsed gestures and distant glances. The pain of those moments wasn't just acknowledged, it was mourned. Charles wasn't just owning the errors of his predecessors, he was confronting them. And in doing so, he allowed the monarchy to be something it had rarely been: human. This wasn't just an apology, it was an act of rebellion against royal tradition. For generations, kings and queens were taught to maintain poise at all costs, never show weakness, never show doubt. But Charles shattered that mask in one defining moment. He didn't offer a perfect image. He offered himself, flaws and all. And that vulnerability, that courage to show his humanity, resonated far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. For a country divided by class, culture, and decades of distrust, this moment landed with power. People saw not a monarch performing duty, but a man attempting redemption. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about image. It was about connection. The kind of connection that could only be built through honesty. And for many, it was the first time they saw the crown not as an institution, but as a beating heart. A heart that finally recognized the weight of the pain carried by the people it claimed to serve. The public responded not with cheers, but with something deeper understanding. Because in that single act, Charles showed that even those born into unimaginable privilege could learn, reflect, and change. He reminded the nation that leadership isn't about appearing infallible. It's about owning your faults and using them to forge a new path forward. And that's exactly what he began to do. But Charles didn't stop with words. He began reshaping the crown from the inside out. No fireworks, no rebellion, just a quiet storm of change rolling in with every handshake and headline. When Charles ascended the throne, many expected upheaval, a dramatic break from the past, a crown worn with the force of reinvention. But instead, the new king took a different path. One marked not by spectacle, but by subtlety. His first year as monarch didn't scream revolution. It whispered it, slowly, deliberately, strategically. Every move felt calculated to shift the monarchy without tearing it apart. He wasn't seeking to destroy tradition. He was trying to evolve it, brick by quiet brick. Behind palace doors, Charles chose diplomacy over disruption. He walked a tightrope between legacy and change, never leaning too far in either direction. And while the nation waited to see if he would wield power boldly, he instead embraced restraint. There were no sweeping laws, no dramatic royal decrees, just a series of soft, almost imperceptible choices that signaled a monarch more interested in repair than reign. In conversations with world leaders, he offered humility. In meetings with British citizens, he offered inclusion. And at home, he rewrote what it meant to be royal in a country desperate for relevance. He began by listening, truly listening, to communities long ignored, to voices far outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. He hosted religious leaders from across the spectrum, not for show, but to signal something greater. This monarchy, under his watch, would reflect a new Britain. A Britain that was multicultural, multi-faith, and no longer confined by the lines drawn centuries ago. For the first time in royal memory, the palace felt like it was being stretched carefully, but meaningfully to hold more than just tradition. Charles also reined in the monarchy's presence, toning down the constant stream of public appearances and pageantry. It wasn't absence, it was refinement. a deliberate move to cut back the noise and make the crown feel less omnipresent, more intentional. He didn't try to dominate headlines. Instead, he allowed his actions and sometimes his silence to speak for him. And in a world where the royal image had often drowned in controversy, that silence became powerful. Where Charles once led campaigns and spoke loudly on causes close to his heart, now he passed the baton. Prince William took the spotlight on climate change and homelessness. It was a shift not just in workload, but in generational focus. Charles knew the monarchy needed younger hands, fresher voices. He wasn't holding on, he was letting go with purpose. Even his coronation, steeped in ancient rituals, bore the fingerprints of change. Alongside the centuries-old oaths and regalia stood something new. Non-Christian leaders joined the ceremony. Grassroots activists walked beside foreign dignitaries. The old world met the new in a moment that quietly dared to challenge the rules of royal identity. It didn't scream revolution, but it murmured possibility. And yet, as the first year of his reign unfolded with caution and grace, a question began to linger. A question that would define not just Charles's future, but the monarchy's very survival. Still, one question loomed. Would subtle change be enough to hold off a monarchy in crisis? For the first time ever, the king won't rule alone because Charles is making room on the throne. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through centuries of royal protocol. Monarchs don't share power. They wear the crown alone. They lead alone. But King Charles shattered that principle with one audacious move, announcing that he would not rule as a solitary figure, but alongside his eldest son. In a quiet but revolutionary shift, Prince William would now stand as co-leader of the monarchy. Not just in name or symbolism, but in real authority. Together, father and son would steer the crown into uncharted territory, two generations bound not just by blood, but by shared responsibility. This wasn't a ceremonial handhold. It was a deliberate act of generational bridging. Charles understood the kingdom was changing, and fast. Younger Britons were growing more skeptical of inherited power, more vocal about justice, accountability, and relevance. To survive, the monarchy couldn't just endure, it had to evolve. William wasn't simply the heir. He was now the engine, the future face of a monarchy designed not to dominate, but to serve. And Charles, long known for his grip on tradition, had just taken a step that no monarch before him had dared. Under this new structure, Prince William would handle the front lines: climate change, foreign relations, homelessness, racial equality. These wouldn't just be passions whispered behind palace walls. They would become policies. His diplomacy wouldn't be confined to ribbon cuttings and photo ops. He would meet world leaders, guide royal initiatives, and shape how the crown interacts with the public and the planet. Charles would remain king, but William would become its voice, its movement, its modern core. Behind this new dual leadership model was a deeper strategy, succession planning that didn't wait for funeral bells. Charles wanted to ensure that when the time came, the transition would feel seamless. Not a disruption, but a continuation. Not the end of an era, but the handoff of a shared vision. This wasn't about stepping down, it was about lifting the next generation up while he still could. And within this shift was something even more radical: shared accountability. For centuries, royals operated in silos. Each king or queen faced history's judgment alone. But Charles's plan spread that weight. Now, leadership would be about collaboration, not command. For the first time, the crown wasn't held by one, it was balanced between two. And in that balance, Charles hoped to reflect the world his subjects lived in. Dynamic, diverse, and ever-changing. Of course, not everyone embraced the idea. Critics argued it blurred roles. Traditionalists feared it weakened the crown's authority. But Charles wasn't seeking comfort, he was making history. He knew the monarchy wouldn't survive if it clung to outdated rules. It had to be reshaped, redefined, and restructured. And that meant breaking from the past, even if it meant sharing the very throne that once stood as a symbol of singular power. And to keep that balance in check, Charles proposed something never seen before in royal history: a monarchy, supervised by the public. King Charles just did the unthinkable. It was the kind of announcement that made royal traditionalists recoil and reformists sit up in stunned silence. For centuries, the British monarchy had operated in shadows steeped in secrecy, protected by protocol, and shielded from the scrutiny that governed every other public institution. But King Charles cracked that shell wide open. With one stroke, he turned centuries of royal privilege into a system of public oversight. For the first time in British history, the crown would be watched, audited, and evaluated not by internal courtiers or elite committees, but by the people themselves. Charles proposed the creation of a citizen-elected council, a group of ordinary individuals chosen from across the UK to review the monarchy's conduct, relevance, and financial activity. Their mission? Not to protect the crown, but to question it, to challenge it, to ensure that every royal action, every trip, every event, every penny served the people who footed the bill. This wasn't about symbolic transparency. It was a formal, binding audit process that would take place every year. No room for ceremony, no space for royal excuses. Just truth, numbers, and hard answers. The announcement landed like a political earthquake. For the monarchy, it was a seismic shift. An institution once built on divine right was now opening its books to democratic review. No longer would royal finances be shrouded in mystery. No longer could questions about excessive spending be met with silence. The council would demand receipts, answers, and accountability. The monarchy would have to prove its worth not to itself, but to the people it claimed to represent. This new oversight council didn't just enforce transparency, it symbolized something deeper: humility. A monarch voluntarily placing limits on his own power. A king choosing scrutiny over sanctity. For Charles, it was the ultimate expression of his belief that the crown must evolve or risk collapse. He wasn't just reforming an institution, he was offering it up piece by piece to public judgment. And in doing so, he reminded the world that royalty, stripped of its illusions, is still a public service, or it is nothing at all. Critics, of course, called it dangerous, a slippery slope, an erosion of monarchy's mystique. But for Charles, that mystique had long become a burden, a wall between the crown and the people. He wanted to tear it down. He wanted the monarchy to be seen, not as an unreachable relic, but as a living, breathing entity that answers to its nation. With this move, he made it clear: there is no sacred crown without public trust. And in that act, Charles did what few monarchs have ever dared. He made himself vulnerable to the people. He turned power into responsibility. And in the process, he redefined what it meant to wear the crown in the 21st century. But Charles didn't stop at structure. He reached for the monarchy's very soul. The oath centuries of monarchs swore the same vow. Now, King Charles wants to rewrite it. For generations, the coronation oath remained untouched, sacred, rigid, and built upon the bones of empires. Monarch after monarch stood beneath vaulted ceilings, robed in tradition, and pledged allegiance to ideas rooted not in equality, but in dominance, divine authority, and rigid hierarchy. But King Charles, ever the unexpected reformer, has chosen to challenge that very foundation. Not with noise, not with rebellion, but with a pen. A vow once carved in stone may now be reshaped in ink. In a move that stunned royal historians and constitutional scholars alike, Charles proposed a radical rewriting of the coronation oath, a reimagining that replaced conquest with compassion, power with service, and obligation with heart. Justice, inclusion, loyalty to all, not just to crown and church, but to the diverse tapestry of people who make up modern Britain. No longer would the monarch vow to dominate, but to uplift. No longer would the words echo with superiority, but with sincerity and love for country. This wasn't about rewriting a script for ceremony's sake. It was about redefining purpose. Charles saw an oath as more than performance, it was a promise. And the old promise no longer reflected the world the crown claimed to represent. Britain was no longer the empire it once ruled. It had changed, grown more diverse, more connected, and more conscious of its past. Charles's proposed oath acknowledged that past, but refused to let it dictate the future. Gone were the calls to defend a single faith. In their place stood a pledge to embrace all communities, all cultures, all beliefs. He envisioned a monarchy that would no longer stand above the row, people, but beside them. That vision wasn't born of rebellion, it was born of reckoning. A reckoning with history, with legacy, and with the very soul of what it means to lead in the 21st century. Some called it bold, others dangerous. But for Charles, it was essential. He understood that a crown that refuses to evolve becomes a relic. And relics don't lead, they fade. His oath would become a reflection of the new monarchy he had worked tirelessly to build, one shaped by transparency, by inclusion, by humility. This wasn't a moment of crisis, it was a moment of clarity. By rewriting the oath, Charles wasn't just redefining monarchy for Britain, he was sending a message to monarchies everywhere. That power is not in pageantry. That strength lies not in silence, but in understanding. That to rule with purpose, one must lead with heart. He may have inherited a throne rooted in the past, but he is forging a legacy that looks only toward the future. As history watches closely, King Charles's bold new vision may just become the blueprint for monarchies across the world. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.